Hello, everybody. My name is Jonathan Corpus Ong. I'm Associate Professor of Global Digital Media at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where I also direct the Global Technology for Social Justice Lab. And I try to introduce a global perspective that tries to hone in on the specific cultural, but also political, regulatory contexts and histories, and making an intervention in global debates about technology and platform governance that centers perspectives and experiences and identities of the global majority, in which the ASEAN experience is part of. And so for my presentation today, and I wish that I could participate live, but unfortunately the time zone isn't working. My presentation is entitled Whole of Society Approaches versus Disinfo, Centering ASEAN. What does that look like? What does that sound like? What do we need to build to get there? So, in my field of disinformation studies, it's become commonplace to say multi-stakeholder approaches are important. We need academics to work with journalists, to work with civil society to fight disinfo. So that's become a commonplace term here in the United States, in also Western Europe. But a lot of this debate doesn't really understand or also engage with inequalities, inequalities and politics of knowledge production. What kinds of frameworks are deemed more important than others? What kinds of tools and interventions become popular, and what are those that are overlooked? And in terms of the flows of knowledge, flows of tools and expertise, is it really top down or bottom up? So those are the kinds of questions that myself and my colleagues in the GlowTech Lab, the Global Technology for Social Justice Lab, are engaged in. Like, it's important to democratize knowledge production. It's important to center experiences outside of Europe and the United States. And if we do that, what risks are we taking? What kinds of voices do we need to amplify for such kinds of perspectives and approaches to emerge? So I'd love to be part of this discussion, but if you have any questions, you can follow me on X at Jonathan_C_Ong. A lot of my research and links to videos and also other resources are on my linktree/John C. Ong. So feel free to follow up with me after this event and we can continue the conversation. So the burning questions that I want to start with and to provoke the discussion would be the following. Are there distinct ASEAN experiences that are overlooked, dismissed, or misunderstood by global North knowledge frames and advocacies about disinformation and democracy? So, in the global space of the media freedom, disinformation, and democracy space, what are those perspectives and, commonplace assertions being made? And do we see ourselves and our experiences, our regulatory environments, our challenges when it comes to lack of resources, lack of trust in our institutions of knowledge? Do we see that reflected in the mainstream perspectives in disinformation studies? Following that, how can we then collaborate better as an ASEAN civil society to center our experiences in disinformation mitigation, tools development, and advocacy? So, what does disinformation mitigation, tools development, advocacy look and sound like if it centers the ASEAN, right? Like, would we be pushing for the same kinds of accountability initiatives? Are we pushing for the same kinds of coalitions that are centered around certain practices and tools? Or would they be radically different? And then to broaden the discussion, how can we foster transnational solidarities and participate in broader global majority movements and participate in South to South knowledge exchange? So for me, this is highly important that we see ourselves not also as a kind of bounded region, right? But see ourselves as sharing a lot in common with other countries in the so-called global majority or global south, right? And I see global majority and use global south as ways in which we could imagine ourselves in relation to political inequalities. Um, and therefore, from this kind of perspective, how can we learn from experiences in other regional centers of excellence? How can we learn from activists in Brazil, from tech regulators in India, from privacy experts in parts of Africa? I think those are important exchanges that need to happen, that we need to cultivate, because often our easy crutch is to copy and paste policy, copy and paste tools. We invite the white speaker from the US or Europe to tell us how we can do things better. I think we need to see ourselves as part of global majority experiences and see our commonalities with them, right? And I think that's so important in the media and democracy space. So now to get a little bit more specific, to talk about the global north experiences and how might they diverge with the ASEAN experiences. So here are just some preliminary thoughts and critiques of mine of global north advocacies that don't always capture the ASEAN experience and the global majority experience for that matter. The first is this kind of easy crutch toward techno-legal solutionism. And this is a term that I think captures a lot of these ways in which um, advocates assume that legal solutions, policies that focus on big technology firms, the tech giants of Silicon Valley, would become the primary solution to kind of like solve this crisis of that we're facing when it comes um, to the disinformation moment. So, in other words, government regulation of Silicon Valley social media content is often the centerpiece of anti-disinformation advocacy. But what if it's not? Right? Like, can we imagine other kinds of solutions that take us out of that techno-legal solutionism crutch? There's no one magic bullet solution when it comes to eradicating fake news. And I think many activists and academics from the global majority, including many who have written from the specific perspectives of ASEAN, would be the first to say that. And I think we need to listen to them more. Number two, and I hear this a lot also in the United States, where I'm currently at, right? So there's some kind of moral panics about how social media and tech platforms have somehow found a way to brainwash the so-called uneducated poor, or in other turns of phrases, the deplorable voters, right? And this is a very anti-poor, very classist narrative explanatory frame that is very seductive, right? To say that TikTok had brainwashed the uneducated teens who did not know their history, right? So it's easy to use moral panics to justify very repressive legislation. I would also say that it is seductive, but it's also counterproductive. Like, If we're trying to win voters to our cause, right? I think it's counterproductive because it sounds so disempowering for these citizens to hear that, you know, academics, journalists, experts, so-called experts, think of them in that way. Talk about them as the deplorables. Talk about them as the uneducated, brainwashed zombies who don't know any better. I think we need to invest in long-term citizen empowerment and political socialization. So I think it's important to understand people and their sources of grievances and anxieties, not to go so quickly to the correction, not to go so quick to the fact check. Like this is why they're so dumb that they fell for this. No, I think it's more interesting to reframe that like this is why this narrative is so seductive to certain disenfranchised populations. These are the techniques in which persuasion is so powerful and seductive. Again, rather than to displace and to talk down on the poor. And number three is a lot of the North and South dynamics. We need to understand the political economy here. That North to South philanthropy, North to South funding flows inadvertently constrain innovation from below, right? Like it's often the tools and knowledge frames and definitions, right? Like those ways of imagining the problem, we copy and paste knowledge from the North, right? Like we're using the same terms developed by the North. For example, mis and disinfo, right? Like we often begin there. Misinfo versus disinfo, it's about intention. Well, for much of the global south, a lot of mis and disinfo is actually in the middle, right? It is less about intention, right? Sometimes it's so unclear how we can even assign intention to a falsehood, right? So we tend to adopt these definitions, and that shapes our solutions. Um, so these kinds of funding flows result in gatekeeping cultures in the academe and also the nonprofit industrial complex, where the same tools developed in the North now become exported, sold, right? Tested, experimented on in the global South. And that becomes the, the main target, the main centerpiece of coalitions. That becomes the main reason for being for civil society coalitions, a toolkit or a knowledge frame from the North. My provocation today is, what if it's not? What if we can develop innovations that actually center our experiences? So I'd like to amplify some examples in the media and disinfo space that kind of concretize some of what I'm talking about. So the first is the case of hashtag pushback UNESCO. In May of 2013, a group of Southeast Asian civil society organizations, along with other transnational organizations based in Australia and other places, collected signatories calling out and speaking out against UNESCO itself, particularly the guidelines for regulating digital platforms that they made available. So, according to civil society organizations from Southeast Asia, and this is a bottom-up collective, right? Like it's a Google Docs that is the starting point of pushback UNESCO. So that Google Docs, and I'm quoting from it here. UNESCO's guidelines will be used to justify domestic overregulation, empower illiberal regulators, and incentivize platforms to comply with government requests, which might be used against human rights workers in the region. So, in other words, Southeast Asian civil society organizations are saying, UNESCO, had you talked to us first, we would have actually come up with a different set of guidelines when it comes to platform accountability initiatives that is not so dependent on, again, techno-legal solutions that are overly focused on whether something should be taken down on social media. Number two, another example, and this comes directly from my sustained research in disinformation studies, particularly my approach to exposing local and regional disinformation for hire economies. So my research published back in 2018, it's cited by Pointer as one of the most useful and most cited studies by fact checkers in the space. And that's something that I find so meaningful, right? Less than academic citations. Is it actually being used by frontliners in the field? And I'm happy that this research was taken up. Architects of Network Disinformation is not about an analysis of social media content, but it's an analysis of the production economies behind disinformation. So I actually interviewed the people who themselves have said that they have offered their services to politicians for their political campaigns, offering services of creating social media accounts, creating fake profiles, managing different kinds of meme campaigns for certain politicians, and attacking others. It's based in the Philippines, and I have since published comparative research on Indonesia, Thailand, and more recently, Brazil. Again, very much focused on the behind the scenes, the workers behind disinformation campaigns. And for me, what I've learned is that there's a class hierarchy of paid operatives, public relations strategies from upper middle class backgrounds, influencers from more aspirational middle class backgrounds, and from more low income backgrounds. There's the fake account operators that their only task is to copy paste content that was already prepared but by the high level political strategists. So for me, this research, which is interview-based, it's ethnographic, it's about developing a sense of trust and rapport with these workers, and also guaranteeing them a sense of protection that I'm not out here to expose them, right? I'm here to focus on the system and the structure rather than going for a name and shame approach. So what my findings are, particularly in digital economies in Southeast Asia, where we've taken to digital industries and digital marketing as sunshine industries, as industries for growth for our national economies. There's a lot of entrepreneurialism in this space. And I find that quite different from the accounts written by my colleagues in the United States, where trolling for them is, this is the white man radicalized and still working and, a geek, still living in their parents' basement, right? So that kind of idea of the radicalized individual, also in a kind of pathologized way. There's also narratives of the white supremacists and the radicalization, right? So if we center digital economies of Southeast Asia, for me, the theme of the troll who's not ideologically driven, but is actually more financially motivated, becomes more the starting point. Where for me, my finding is that the trolls that I interviewed did not consider themselves a troll. So nobody called themselves a troll. Their titles is PR strategist, account manager, social media operator, right? And they would say that, doing this for politicians, attacking rival politicians, I do it as a side hustle. I do it because I need an extra income. And so I find that important to center, like trying to understand the system and structure, and the other kinds of industries complicit to this info, rather than just focusing on key political figures or the idea of far right radicalization. So my critique is that a lot of journalist investigations tend to go after low-level workers. They tend to go after easy targets like influencers, and they often criticize these influencers as um, modeling crass language, for example, very uncivil language. But if you look at it as a whole system, right? You realize that it's kind of useless to go after the low level worker. You need to go after the political and commercial elites running the show, the politicians and the PR strategist, that is the architect, the disinformation architect behind the campaign. And if you go there, what I find fascinating is that at that level, it's actually an open secret who these people are. But through various kinds of, again, relationships, social relationships among the elites, who at that level, they just tend to cover for each other, right? And I think that's fascinating to think about. So, what would disinformation mitigation look like if we center this kind of story? Um, I've tried to make this research more popular and accessible by producing a podcast called Catch Me If You Can, which is always about trying to interrupt stereotypes and assumptions of the people who work in disinformation, right? So the objective of our podcast is we interview a troll and our listeners get to hear their voices. And the aim here is to humanize the troll, not to apologize for them or not to make them ordinary, um, to judge them, absolutely, but to understand how they got there, what were the life events that got them there, and to prevent other people from falling into that same rabbit hole, right? And we're glad in 2022 it was one of the top 5% most followed podcasts of Spotify globally. And I would love to invite you folks to listen to Catch Me If You Can. I'm very proud of this collaboration that I work with investigative journalist Kat Ventura, who's now at Columbia University School of Journalism, also innovating in this space from her own standpoint. So for me, Disinformation for Hire is a story that is quite common in the Southeast Asian experience, where for us, these kinds of illicit economies is an everyday form of digital labor. And I think I've collected a set of articles that in a journal special issue, Social Media and Society, and I would like to invite you to check it out. It's an open access. You can check it on my linktree/John C. Ong. And our objective here is to get stories of troll farms in the Arab world, click farms in Indonesia, right? Trying to understand essential oils and the business of selling essential oils and how it's proximal to conspiracy theory, for example. So the pyramid schemes of essential oil selling and how the digital disinformation industry, turbocharges that. So it's a set of articles that moves beyond dystopian narratives of, social media is out to, create falsehoods, right? But it actually retells disinformation production using the genre of what I would say slow burn horror, that it's so ordinary that these people don't see themselves as villains, right? Like they're just not thinking about ethics, right? Like that's the story here. The articles collect stories that diversify, humanize, and judge disinformation perpetrators and the audiences who believe them, right? Like trying to interrupt those stereotypes. And from a regulatory standpoint, it's not about social media companies whether content should be taken down or not, but it's about ethics and accountability in influencer marketing, political advertising, and political consultancies. How come these industries are not regulated with same kinds of accountability initiatives, transparency initiatives? Can we name the people behind political campaigns to actually compel a sense of accountability for the people who are behind these campaigns in the first place? To move beyond this kind of top-down legal measure of should speech be taken down or not, right? Like instead, it's about transparency, making things more open, right? And it's both a more humble ask than taking something down, but it's also challenging because these people do not want to be regulated because there's just so much money in this space. So finally, I would like to end with this slide. It's an invitation for those of you who want to participate in these kinds of conversations. My lab in Amherst, Massachusetts, we're hosting an event empowering election integrity in the global majority. And it launches a study that compares Brazil and the Philippines and our election integrity coalitions from 2022. And it's a study that is interview-based, trying to understand the experiences of Brazil versus Philippine civil society, comparing and contrasting them. And through an event in Rio de Janeiro last November, together with scholars like Ethan Zuckerman, Sahana Odupa, many fascinating Brazil scholars as well, but scholars from India and South Africa, they were able to participate in these discussions. And some of the arguments that we make that would be relevant to your discussion would be, we need more regional centers for excellence, right? Like rather than copy pasting the Reuters Institute in Oxford, and I love Rasmus Nielsen, I collaborate with him, but rather than copy pasting what they've done, rather than copy pasting my colleague Joan Donovan and what she's done, it's about how can we help boost innovation and insight from our countries? How can we develop these regional centers for excellence that center global majority experience in their accountability initiatives and policy advocacy? We found as well that fact-checking is a beginning, not an end. We often found that a lot of the coalitions around elections are centered around fact-checking tools, are around browsers, are around practices of fact-checking. And then coalitions get a lot of funding for fact-checking. And so many people want to join these coalitions, and it is a great show of force. But if a coalition is tools first, or is about like focused on something tech-centric, it often erases disciplinary diversity, right? And so the examples that we found were that, like in Brazil, they were very good at leveraging each civil society organization's unique skill set such that they're not compelled to do fact-checking like the rest of the people, but they're like, okay, you do your different kinds of narrative campaigns, or you do your investigations of disinformation economies, or you look at advertising, right? And how advertising and influencer marketing. So that's a good kind of coalition rather than if it becomes tools first and then you have a youth empowerment group and suddenly they have to retrain themselves to be fact checkers so they can get access to funding. I think that's a problematic approach. So finally, whole of society, what does that mean? I think we need to blast open the disinformation and democracy space. We need to make sure that conversations that we're having are really diverse in terms of race, geography, language, gender, sexuality, and discipline, for us to have a more robust conversation so that we can actually be exposed to new ways of working, new ways of collaborating, and new insights rather than copy pasting what has already been done and what obviously is not really working very well. Thank you so much.